The first person to insult me at my grandmother's funeral was my sister. The second was my uncle. By the time the service ended, 3 relatives had questioned why I was even there. I stood beside Grandma's casket listening to people talk about family loyalty, respect, and love. The same people who had spent years pretending I didn't belong. The same people who stopped answering my calls after Grandpa died. The same people who suddenly became experts on what Grandma would have wanted. I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed with them, because Grandma taught me something years earlier. She always said, when people are desperate to tell your story, let them. The truth eventually gets its turn. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. But I did that day. Because 30 minutes after the funeral ended, everyone gathered inside Grandma's lawyer's office. My sister smiled. My uncle looked confident. And my mother acted like everything had already been decided. They thought they knew exactly what Grandma had left behind. They thought they knew exactly who she trusted. Then the lawyer opened a sealed envelope, and the first sentence of Grandma's final letter changed everything. My sister stopped smiling. My uncle couldn't look up. And suddenly, the people who mocked me at her funeral became very interested in hearing my side of the story. But to understand why Grandma's letter shocked everyone, you need to understand what happened during the final years of her life, because the truth started long before her funeral. My name is Emily. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, Grandma Margaret was the only person in my family who truly saw me. Not the version everyone else talked about, the real me. Growing up, my family had a favorite, my older sister, Rachel. Rachel was charming, confident, outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. People loved her, teachers loved her, relatives loved her. And eventually my parents started treating that popularity like proof that she was somehow better than me. Rachel got praised for effort. I got criticized for results. Rachel got excuses. I got expectations. Rachel made mistakes. I got blamed for them. The difference wasn't always obvious, at least not to outsiders. It came through hundreds of small moments, small enough to ignore individually, large enough to shape an entire childhood. When I was 12, I won a regional art competition. I spent months preparing. The day I received the award, I couldn't wait to show my family. Mom smiled politely. Dad nodded. Then Rachel mentioned a school dance. Within minutes, everyone was discussing her dress. My award disappeared from the conversation completely. I remember sitting there holding the certificate, waiting, hoping someone would ask another question. Nobody did, except Grandma. The next day, she drove 2 hours to my house, just to take me out for lunch. She sat across from me at a small diner and said something I'll never forget. Never confuse being ignored with being unimportant. At 12 years old, I didn't fully understand. But those words stayed with me. Over the years, Grandma became my safe place. When my parents forgot important events, Grandma remembered. When relatives compared me to Rachel, Grandma defended me. When I doubted myself, Grandma reminded me who I was. And unfortunately, she was usually the only one. By the time I reached college, the gap between Rachel and me had grown even wider. Rachel remained the family star. I became the family disappointment. Not because I failed, because I chose a different path. Rachel stayed close to home. I moved away for university. Rachel attended every family gathering. I worked internships during holidays. Rachel mastered family politics. I focused on building a career. Over time, relatives started treating distance as disloyalty, especially my Uncle David. Uncle David had strong opinions about everything, especially other people's lives. According to him, family members should always stay close, always attend gatherings, always prioritize family above everything else. Of course, those rules somehow never applied to Rachel, only me. If Rachel missed a birthday, she was busy. If I missed one, I was selfish. If Rachel forgot to call Grandma, she was overwhelmed. If I forgot, I was ungrateful. The double standard became exhausting. But Grandma noticed. She always noticed. One Christmas, after listening to relatives criticize me for missing a family barbecue because of work, Grandma finally spoke up. Funny. The room went silent. Nobody interrupted Grandma when she used that tone. Emily misses one barbecue and everyone talks about it for 6 months. She looked toward Rachel. Rachel hasn't visited me in 3 months. Silence. Nobody had an answer. Because Grandma wasn't interested in family politics. She was interested in facts. That moment embarrassed several relatives, especially Rachel. And from that day forward, something changed. Rachel stopped seeing Grandma as an ally. She started seeing her as an obstacle. At first, the tension was subtle: small comments, forced smiles, awkward conversations. Then Grandma's health started declining. Everything became worse. The diagnosis wasn't immediately serious, but it was enough to require regular medical appointments, extra care, additional support. That's when I started visiting more often. Every weekend, every holiday, every free afternoon. Not because I expected anything in return, because she mattered, because she had spent decades showing up for me. And now it was my turn. Meanwhile, something interesting happened. The relatives who constantly talked about family loyalty suddenly became very busy. Uncle David rarely visited. Rachel visited when it was convenient. Several cousins disappeared completely. Yet every family gathering featured the same speeches about devotion and responsibility. Grandma noticed that too. One afternoon, while sitting on her porch, she looked at me and smiled. "You know what's funny?" "What?" She laughed softly. "The people who talk most about family are usually the ones doing the least for it." I laughed. But deep down, I knew she was right. And unfortunately, so did she. Because over the next 2 years, Grandma watched exactly who showed up and exactly who didn't. She watched who called, who visited, who helped, who cared. And without realizing it, the entire family was writing a story that would eventually be read aloud inside a lawyer's office. A story nobody expected, especially Rachel. Because while everyone else focused on appearances, Grandma paid attention to actions. And that difference was about to change everything. For the next 2 years, Grandma's health slowly declined. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to change everyday life. She moved a little slower, needed help with appointments, forgot small details occasionally, and although she tried not to show it, I could see the frustration in her eyes. Grandma had always been independent, the kind of woman who fixed things herself, the kind who hated asking for help, the kind who spent her entire life taking care of everyone else. Now she was being forced to depend on people, and that wasn't easy for her. So I visited as often as possible, every weekend, most holidays, any free day I could find. Sometimes I drove 3 hours just to spend an afternoon with her. We'd sit on the porch, drink tea, talk about life, watch the sunset. Sometimes we'd talk for hours. Sometimes we'd sit quietly. Neither of us needed constant conversation. The important thing was showing up. And Grandma noticed. One afternoon, she smiled at me and said, "You know, Emily, you've visited me more this year than some people have in 5 years." I laughed. "That's because I like you more than they do." Grandma laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. But beneath the joke was a truth neither of us said out loud. A lot of family members talked about love. Very few actually demonstrated it. Then something unexpected happened. Rachel suddenly became interested. Very interested. Almost overnight. She started calling Grandma constantly, sending flowers, sending cards, posting old photos online, writing long messages about family. At first, I thought it was sweet. Maybe Rachel was changing. Maybe she genuinely wanted a closer relationship. Maybe she finally realized what mattered. Then I noticed something strange. Every visit happened when other people were watching. Every phone call was mentioned publicly. Every act of kindness somehow became social media content. Grandma noticed too. One afternoon, she showed me a post Rachel had made. The caption was nearly 3 paragraphs long. It described their special bond, their unbreakable connection, their weekly visits. Grandma looked at me, then smiled. "I haven't seen her in 3 weeks." I stared at the post, then at Grandma, then back at the post. "What?" Grandma nodded. "Exactly." For a moment, we both sat quietly. Then Grandma laughed. Not angry laughter, amused laughter. The kind that comes when someone is trying too hard. And unfortunately, Rachel wasn't the only one changing. Uncle David suddenly became much more involved too. The same uncle who rarely visited, the same uncle who always had an excuse, the same uncle who claimed he was too busy. Now he appeared constantly, bringing groceries, offering advice, checking on Grandma, calling relatives. At first glance, it looked admirable, but something felt off, very off, especially because most conversations eventually drifted toward the same subject: money, property, inheritance. One evening, I arrived unexpectedly and found Uncle David sitting in Grandma's kitchen. The moment I entered, both of them stopped talking. Immediately. That awkward silence lasted just a little too long, long enough to raise questions. Everything okay? I asked. David smiled. Of course. But the smile looked forced, and Grandma seemed unusually quiet. I didn't push. At least not then. Later that evening, after David left, Grandma sat at the kitchen table staring out the window. Something was bothering her, I could tell. Finally, I asked, "What's wrong?" Grandma sighed, then looked at me. People become very interesting when they think someone has something they want. The statement surprised me. What does that mean? Grandma smiled sadly. It means some people visit because they care. She paused. And some people visit because they're counting. A chill ran down my spine, because suddenly everything made sense. Rachel's sudden attention, David's constant visits, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. None of it felt accidental anymore, and unfortunately, things only got worse. A month later, Grandma's health declined again, this time more seriously. The doctors weren't overly alarmed, but they recommended additional care, more supervision, more support. The news spread quickly through the family, and suddenly everyone became an expert. Relatives who hadn't visited in years started offering opinions. Family group chats exploded with suggestions, advice, arguments, disagreements. And somehow every conversation turned into a debate about Grandma's future. Not Grandma's happiness, Grandma's future assets, her house, her savings, her property, things she wasn't even discussing. One evening, I accidentally overheard a conversation that changed everything. I was walking toward the living room when I heard Rachel speaking with Uncle David. They didn't know I was nearby, and what I heard made me stop instantly. Rachel laughed. "I'm telling you, she's definitely changing something." David lowered his voice. "She'd better not." Rachel sighed. "Emily's been spending too much time with her." Silence. Then David spoke again. "We need to make sure emotions don't influence decisions." My stomach dropped. Because they weren't worried about Grandma. They were worried about inheritance. Nothing else. And suddenly every visit, every phone call, every social media post started looking very different. That night I told Grandma what I'd heard. She listened quietly, without interruption, without surprise. When I finished, she simply nodded. Then she said something that confused me. "Good." I blinked. "Good?" Grandma smiled. "Now I know exactly who people are." At the time, I didn't understand. But she did. Because while the rest of the family focused on what they might receive, Grandma was paying attention to something else. Character, integrity, truth. And unknown to everyone else, she had already started making decisions. Important decisions. Permanent decisions. Decisions that would eventually be revealed after her funeral. Decisions hidden inside a sealed envelope waiting on a lawyer's desk. And when that envelope was finally opened, the people who mocked me at Grandma's funeral would wish they had stayed silent. As Grandma's health continued to decline, something became impossible to ignore. The people who had spent years keeping their distance suddenly wanted to be involved in every decision, every appointment, every discussion, every detail. Rachel called almost daily, not to ask how Grandma felt, not to ask what she needed, but to ask questions that sounded innocent while revealing something else. Did Grandma mention her house? Has she talked about future plans? Has she updated any paperwork? At first, she tried to sound casual, but eventually the pattern became obvious. Even Grandma noticed. One afternoon, we were sitting together on the porch when she started laughing unexpectedly. "What?" I asked. Grandma shook her head. "Your sister asked more questions about my documents this month than she's asked about my health all year." I couldn't help laughing. But underneath the humor was disappointment, because Rachel wasn't hiding it anymore. Neither was Uncle David. The two of them had become almost inseparable. Constant phone calls, private conversations, long meetings that always seemed to stop when someone entered the room. One evening I arrived with groceries and found David sitting at Grandma's dining table. Papers were spread across the surface, several folders, a calculator, a notebook. The moment he saw me, he closed everything. Immediately. Too quickly. Grandma noticed my expression. David noticed it too. Just helping your grandmother organize things. His smile felt forced. I nodded politely, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. That night, after David left, Grandma sat quietly in her favorite chair, looking tired, looking older than I had ever seen her. Then she surprised me. "Do you know what bothers me most?" I looked up. "What?" She sighed. "The assumption." I frowned. "What assumption?" Grandma smiled sadly. "That because I'm old, I don't notice what's happening." The room fell silent, because she noticed everything. Every fake visit, every forced conversation, every sudden act of kindness. And she was tired of pretending otherwise. A few weeks later, things escalated. Rachel started bringing relatives into the situation. Cousins, aunts, family friends. People who hadn't visited Grandma in months suddenly began appearing. Some brought flowers, others brought gifts. A few brought long speeches about family unity. Grandma thanked them politely, then watched them leave. And every time the front door closed, she would give me the same look. The look that said, "Now they remember I exist." One afternoon, I arrived early and overheard a conversation between Rachel and David in the kitchen. Neither realized I was standing nearby. Rachel sounded frustrated. "What if she changes everything?" David lowered his voice. "She won't." Rachel wasn't convinced. "How do you know?" David answered immediately. "Because she knows what's fair." The way he emphasized the word fair made my stomach tighten. Because what he meant wasn't fairness. He meant control. He meant getting what he expected. He meant making sure things happened the way he wanted. I stepped into the kitchen. The conversation stopped instantly. Rachel looked startled. David forced another smile, the same fake smile I'd seen for months. Neither said another word. And for the first time, I realized something important. They weren't confident. They were worried. Because deep down, they knew Grandma saw through them. The following month, Grandma's health worsened significantly. Hospital visits became more frequent. Energy became harder to maintain. Simple tasks became exhausting. Still, she remained remarkably sharp. Her memory was strong. Her humor remained intact. And her ability to read people never faded. One evening, while I helped organize old photo albums, Grandma pulled a small envelope from a drawer. She looked at it for several seconds, then placed it back, carefully. I didn't ask questions, but she noticed me watching. "Some things," she said softly, "make more sense after people reveal themselves." I had no idea what she meant. Not then. Months later, those words would become unforgettable. Because Grandma wasn't preparing for the end, she was preparing for the truth, and she wanted that truth revealed at exactly the right moment. Then came the phone call I had feared for years. The call arrived just after midnight. I knew what it meant before I answered. The hospital, the doctor, the silence in his voice. Grandma was gone. The following days felt unreal. Family members flooded social media with emotional tributes. People posted photographs, stories, memories. Some were genuine, others felt performative. Rachel posted a long message describing herself as Grandma's closest companion. When I read it, I nearly laughed. Because during Grandma's final year, I could count Rachel's actual visits on both hands. But apparently online, they had been inseparable. The funeral was scheduled 5 days later, and almost immediately tensions began appearing. Arguments over seating, arguments over flowers, arguments over speeches, arguments over who should speak. Everyone seemed focused on appearances. Very few seemed focused on Grandma. Then the funeral day arrived. I walked into the chapel carrying a mixture of grief and exhaustion. And within minutes, the humiliation began. The first comment came from Rachel. She looked at me and sighed dramatically. "At least you managed to make time for this." Several relatives heard it. A few laughed awkwardly. I stood frozen. Because no matter what I did, the narrative never changed. If I showed up, it wasn't enough. If I stayed away, I was selfish. Then Uncle David joined in. "Family should always come first." The comment wasn't directed at everyone. It was directed at me. And everyone knew it. By the time the service started, Multiple relatives had already treated me like an outsider at my own grandmother's funeral. What none of them realized was that within the next hour, they'd all be sitting inside a lawyer's office, and waiting on the desk would be a sealed envelope, an envelope containing Grandma's final letter. A letter she had written after watching everything. The favoritism, the manipulation, the pretending, the greed. And when that letter was finally read aloud, the people mocking me that morning would wish they had never opened their mouths. The funeral ended just after noon. People hugged, offered condolences, shared memories, and for a few minutes, it almost felt peaceful. Almost. Then reality returned. As guests slowly left the chapel, small groups gathered outside, talking, whispering, speculating, not about Grandma, about what came next: the house, the savings, the land, the inheritance. I overheard more conversations in 30 minutes than I had during the previous 6 months, and nearly all of them involved money. Rachel seemed especially confident. She stood with several relatives discussing future plans as though decisions had already been made. Grandma always trusted me, she smiled. I handled a lot of things for her. Several relatives nodded. Nobody challenged her. Because Rachel had spent years building a reputation, a carefully crafted image, the devoted granddaughter, the family favorite, the responsible one. And most people believed it, at least for now. Meanwhile, Uncle David acted strangely calm. Too calm. The kind of calm people display when they think they already know the outcome. As if he had mentally divided everything before the lawyer had even spoken. A few relatives even congratulated him. Before anyone knew what Grandma's wishes actually were, the entire situation felt surreal. And honestly, it made me angry. Not because of the inheritance, because Grandma had spent her entire life being reduced to possessions, even before she was laid to rest. An hour later, the family gathered at Attorney Michael Harper's office. The building was quiet, professional, almost intimidating. One by one, relatives entered the conference room. Rachel chose a seat near the front. Uncle David sat beside her. Mom sat across from them. I took a chair near the end of the table, the same place I seemed to occupy in most family situations. Present, but overlooked. Eventually, Attorney Harper entered carrying several folders. The room immediately became silent. He greeted everyone politely, then sat down. Thank you all for coming. His voice was calm, measured. As you know, Margaret Bennett left detailed instructions regarding her estate. Rachel smiled. David crossed his arms confidently. Several relatives leaned forward. The atmosphere changed instantly. Everyone was waiting for confirmation, waiting for validation, waiting for reward. Attorney Harper opened the first folder. For legal reasons, we'll review everything exactly as written. He adjusted his glasses, then paused. There is one specific instruction your grandmother insisted upon. The room grew quiet. What instruction? Rachel asked. The lawyer reached into the folder and removed a sealed envelope. The moment I saw it, something felt familiar. The handwriting, the careful lettering. I recognized it immediately. Grandma's. My heart skipped. Attorney Harper looked around the room. Margaret requested that this letter be read before any discussion of assets or distributions. A few relatives exchanged confused looks. Rachel looked annoyed. David frowned, but neither objected. The lawyer carefully opened the envelope, removed several pages, then began reading. To my family. The room instantly became silent. If you're hearing this letter, it means I'm no longer here to speak for myself. A lump formed in my throat, because suddenly it felt like Grandma was sitting in the room with us. First, I want to thank every person who genuinely loved me. The lawyer continued. Not the people who spoke the loudest. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Not the people who appeared when it was convenient. Rachel's smile disappeared slightly. And not the people who believed love could be measured through appearances. The room became even quieter. Attorney Harper continued reading. During my final years, I learned something important. People reveal who they are when they think nobody is paying attention. My eyes widened, because suddenly I remembered something. All those conversations, all those visits, all those observations. Grandma had been watching. Everything. The lawyer turned the page. I watched who called. I watched who visited. I watched who helped. Most importantly, I watched who expected recognition for helping. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone knew exactly where this was heading, and many of them didn't like it. Attorney Harper continued. Some family members spent years talking about loyalty while showing very little of it. Rachel lowered her eyes. David's jaw tightened. Others quietly showed up without asking for credit. My chest tightened. Because for the first time I had a feeling I knew who Grandma was talking about. The lawyer looked around the room, then read the next sentence. And everything changed. Emily, if you're sitting in that room, I want you to know something. Every head turned toward me. Immediately, I froze. My heart started pounding. Because suddenly this wasn't a letter to the family. It was a letter to me. You spent years believing you were less important than others. My eyes filled with tears. You were wrong. The room remained completely silent. Not a single person spoke. Not a single person moved. Because Grandma's words carried a weight nobody could ignore. Attorney Harper continued. You showed me more kindness during my final years than anyone else. Rachel looked stunned. David stared at the table. And for the first time that day, neither of them looked confident. Because Grandma wasn't finished. Not even close. The next page contained something none of them expected. Something Grandma had kept secret from everyone. Including Rachel. Including Uncle David. A decision that would completely change everything they thought they knew about her estate. And when Attorney Harper read it aloud, the room would erupt into chaos. The room was completely silent. No whispers, no movement, no nervous laughter, nothing. Everyone sat frozen as Attorney Harper held the next page of Grandma's letter. Rachel looked pale. Uncle David stared at the table, and for the first time all afternoon, neither of them appeared confident. Attorney Harper adjusted the pages, then continued reading. There is something I need my family to understand. The lawyer paused briefly. Kindness performed for attention is not kindness. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. Love performed for recognition is not love. The room grew even quieter. And family loyalty means very little when it only appears after someone becomes useful. Rachel's face tightened. David folded his arms. Neither looked happy, because everyone knew exactly who Grandma was talking about. Attorney Harper continued. For the last 3 years of my life, I paid close attention. Not to promises, not to speeches, to actions. The words hit the room like a wave. Some people told others they were helping me. Others actually helped me. Several relatives exchanged glances. Because suddenly every visit, every conversation, every excuse was being judged by the one person who had witnessed it all. The lawyer turned another page, then read the sentence that changed everything. Rachel, I know you believed appearances would matter more than actions. Rachel froze. Completely froze. The room turned toward her. You often spoke about being my closest granddaughter. But titles mean very little without effort. Rachel looked as though someone had punched the air from her lungs. Attorney Harper continued. I do not write this out of anger. I write it out of honesty. The relationship you described to others was not the relationship we actually had. Gasps spread through the room. Several relatives looked stunned, because Rachel had spent years telling everyone the opposite. The lawyer continued. I loved you, Rachel. But loving someone does not require pretending. The room fell silent again. Rachel lowered her eyes. For once, there was no argument, no explanation, no defense. Because Grandma's words were undeniable. Then came Uncle David's turn. Attorney Harper looked down at the page and continued reading. David, You often spoke about fairness. David immediately stiffened. Yet fairness was rarely your actual concern. A few relatives looked at each other. The lawyer kept reading. You spent more time discussing my possessions than my happiness. The room erupted into whispers. David's face turned red. You frequently advised others about family loyalty while showing very little interest in maintaining it yourself. Another wave of shocked reactions moved through the room, because everyone remembered those conversations. The speeches, the lectures, the criticism. Grandma had remembered too. Every single one. Attorney Harper paused, then opened a second folder. This next section references additional documents. Rachel immediately looked up. Additional documents? Several relatives leaned forward. The lawyer carefully removed a stack of papers. Official papers, signed papers, witnessed papers. The atmosphere changed instantly, because suddenly this wasn't just a letter. It was evidence. Attorney Harper placed the documents on the table, then spoke. Margaret kept detailed records. A chill ran through the room. Detailed records, very detailed records. Appointment logs, visitor records, medical support schedules, volunteer forms, notes, correspondence, years of documentation, and every document told the same story. Emily had been there, again and again and again. Meanwhile, many of the people claiming devotion appeared only occasionally. The proof was impossible to ignore. Rachel stared at the papers. Uncle David looked furious, but neither could challenge the records, because the records were accurate, painfully accurate. Then Attorney Harper opened the final folder. The folder everyone had been waiting for. The estate folder. Immediately, the room became silent. Everyone knew what came next. The inheritance, the house, the savings, the land, the assets. Rachel sat forward. David straightened in his chair. Even relatives who had remained quiet suddenly looked interested. Attorney Harper glanced down at the documents, then spoke carefully. Margaret made significant changes approximately 11 months ago. Rachel blinked. 11 months ago? David frowned, because neither of them knew about any changes. The lawyer continued. Those changes were legally witnessed, legally documented, and legally binding. The room became tense, very tense. Rachel's confidence was gone now, completely gone, because for the first time all day she genuinely didn't know what was coming. Neither did David. Attorney Harper looked at the final page, then took a slow breath. Before I read the distribution instructions, there is one final message from Margaret. The room froze. One final message. Grandma's last words before revealing everything. And according to the expression on Attorney Harper's face, those words were about to change the entire room. The conference room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone stared at Attorney Harper as he held the final page of Grandma's letter. Rachel looked nervous. Uncle David looked angry. Several relatives seemed confused, and for the first time all afternoon, nobody appeared certain about what was coming next. Attorney Harper adjusted his glasses, then began reading. Before my estate is distributed, I want my family to understand something. The room became even quieter. Money reveals character. A few relatives exchanged glances. Not because it changes people, because it exposes who they already are. The words hung in the air. Over the last few years, I have watched family members argue over things that were never theirs. I have watched people compete for recognition they did not earn. And I have watched others quietly give their time without expecting anything in return. I felt my throat tighten, because I knew exactly who she meant. The lawyer continued. The greatest gift a person can give is not money. It is presence. The willingness to show up when nobody is watching. Several relatives lowered their eyes. That is why I made the decisions I am about to reveal. Attorney Harper folded the letter carefully, then opened the estate documents. The room became tense immediately. Rachel sat forward. Uncle David straightened in his chair. Everyone waited. Attorney Harper looked down, then began. Margaret Bennett's primary residence. The room froze. Will be transferred in full ownership to Emily Bennett. Complete silence. Absolute silence. Rachel stopped breathing. David stared at the lawyer. Several relatives looked stunned, because Grandma's house was the most valuable asset in the estate, and it now belonged to me. Attorney Harper continued. The contents of the residence, including personal collections, family photographs, heirlooms, and keepsakes, are also designated to Emily Bennett. Gasps filled the room. Rachel looked as though she might faint, because she had expected the opposite. For years, she had expected the house, expected the recognition, expected the reward. Instead, Grandma had chosen differently. Attorney Harper continued reading. A charitable donation fund established in Margaret Bennett's name will receive a portion of the estate. Several relatives nodded approvingly. That sounded exactly like Grandma, helping people even after she was gone. Then came the final revelation. The remaining estate assets will be divided among designated beneficiaries as outlined in the accompanying documents. Rachel immediately interrupted. What does that mean? Attorney Harper looked up calmly. It means the estate was divided according to Margaret's instructions. Rachel's voice shook. But why would she do this? The lawyer answered without hesitation. She explained that in her letter. Silence. Because he was right. She had explained it. Very clearly. She rewarded actions, not appearances. Commitment, not speeches. Love, not performance. Rachel looked around the room, searching for support. There wasn't any. Because everyone had heard the letter. Everyone had heard the truth. And suddenly the narrative Rachel had built for years was collapsing. Uncle David stood up. This isn't fair. The room immediately turned toward him. Fair. The same word he had repeated for years, the same word Grandma had mentioned in her letter. Attorney Harper remained calm. The documents are legally valid. David's face reddened. That's not what I mean. But nobody responded, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. He wasn't upset about fairness. He was upset about disappointment. The outcome hadn't matched his expectations, and for the first time, people could see the difference. One of my cousins finally spoke. Grandma made her choice. Another nodded. She had every right to. Soon others agreed, one after another. Not because they were choosing my side, because they were choosing Grandma's. And nobody could argue with that. Rachel sat quietly. The confidence she carried all morning was gone. Completely gone. Then something unexpected happened. She looked at me. Really looked at me. Not as competition. Not as an obstacle. As a person. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't realize. Her voice broke. I honestly didn't realize how much she depended on you. For a moment, nobody spoke, because it was probably the most honest thing Rachel had said in years. I nodded slowly. Neither of us knew what else to say. Some wounds take time. Some relationships need rebuilding. But at least the truth was finally in the room. And that mattered. After the meeting ended, relatives slowly left the office. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, more honest. Many people approached me, not to talk about inheritance, to talk about Grandma, their favorite memories, their regrets, their appreciation, and somehow that felt more valuable than anything written in the documents. Later that evening, I returned to Grandma's house alone. The house felt different, not empty, peaceful. I walked through each room remembering conversations, laughter, advice, stories. Then I sat in her favorite chair, the same chair where she once told me, never confuse being ignored with being unimportant. For years, I had struggled to believe those words. Now I finally understood them, because Grandma had seen me, not just during her final years, my entire life. And even after she was gone, she made sure everyone else saw me too. Months later, I framed a copy of her letter, not because of the inheritance, because of the lesson that changed everything. People can control the story for a while, they can spread opinions, repeat labels, create narratives, but eventually truth catches up, and when it does, appearances lose their power. What remains are actions, the things people actually did, the love they actually showed, the time they actually gave. Grandma understood that better than anyone, and in the end, that understanding became her final gift. Not the house, not the money, not the inheritance, the truth.